Without this protection, they're going to be under economic strain. And how are they going to pay for their socialist programs?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They sit there and they talk about, all these social programs that they have over here. Those social programs are running on our backs. We've been paying for it, not them. The things that we are paying for, they're using those to offset things that they don't have to pay for, that they could spend in their social, protection umbrellas and all this other crap. They know that if the United States enforces these tariffs, they're going to collapse. It's just not sustainable.
Some of my more liberal friends are claiming that we're going to irreparably harm our relationship with our allies. What do you say to that?
Well, let me ask you something, Rob. If you had a friend who was a thief, who came into your home and constantly went from your home with your silverware or some other thing of value every time he came to visit you, what would you do? These people have been stealing from us for 40 years, maybe even longer. All right? And you think, hey, listen, they want to get tit for tat. Let's say, okay, you want to keep your tariffs high? We will reciprocate. And if you don't like that, how about if we pull our 2 carrier fleets out of the Red Sea? How about if we do that? You see, we are protecting the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Now, 40% of global trade transits through that waterway. Okay? And 80% of the trade to Europe goes through that waterway. What if the Americans just say, all right, we're going to call our Navy back? Who do you think is going to protect that strait or the Red Sea? You think Germany's going to do it?
I think I'm getting your drift here. You're saying they'll come back eventually because they can't pay for their own defense.
They have no choice. They have no choice. What if we do the same thing in the Indian Ocean? You know how much trade transits there? Do you know what it would do to the prices of food, coffee, energy, all sorts of input if those new trade routes had to go around the Horn of Africa and into the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar?
America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief Podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. The Liberty Brief Podcast, episode 31, The Tariff Debate. What's Trump's angle? Welcome back to the Liberty Brief, everyone. I'm your host, Robert Melso, and today we're examining a topic that's been making headlines again, tariffs. And to help us unpack this oft-debated subject, we have my co-host in crime, Dr. Thomas Giordano, author of the book, Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters. Hello again, Dr. Tom.
Yo, Rob, come stai?
Io sto bene, e tu?
Diciamo bene, almeno credo di star bene. Ho sofferto da cane negli ultimi giorni. No, stavo passando un calcolo renale e mi ha fatto morire.
I got half of that.
Vabbè, you got it?
I really appreciate these little mini Italian lessons.
Okay.
So, Dr. Tom, tariffs seem like a pretty straightforward idea, taxes on imported goods, but their history and the reasons behind them seem a bit more complex, right? Let's start with a quick trip down memory lane. I know the media seems to give the impression that this is some new scheme developed by President Trump, but when did the U.S. start first using tariffs?
Well, do you expect anything from the media to be truthful? I mean,
that was a big ask.
Yeah. Huh? Well, listen, Rob, England had no personal income tax at the time of our revolution. And they had run their country on tariffs for centuries. It was one of the reasons that the colonists had consistently complained about. Remember the Boston Tea Party?
Yeah, I heard about that.
Yeah, you remember? Well, today we would say, they were taxed, the tea tax, but it was a tariff on imported goods, actually exported from England, but imported to the colonies. Now, let's also not forget about all trade goods going to and from England and Europe. they were taxed by the British commercial interests in London, right? They claimed it was justified because they were protecting North Atlantic trade routes, right? So tariffs were a common means of every government's income. And they have been a part of the American economic landscape since the very beginning. In fact, one of the first major laws passed by the first Congress in 1789 was the Tariff Act of 1789. Okay,
so right out of the gate, we were messing with tariffs. What was the idea behind that first tariff?
Well, there were a couple of key objectives. Primarily, it was to raise revenue for the brand new federal government. I mean, think about it. They had war debts to pay off from the Revolution, but there was also a push to encourage and protect budding American manufacturers.
All right, so even then, there was this tension between raising money and shielding domestic industries, right?
Precisely. You had figures like Alexander Hamilton, remember? He was a Federalist who saw tariffs as a crucial source of revenue and a way to nurture those infant industries. On the other hand, someone like James Madison, while agreeing on the need for revenue, also hoped that tariffs could lead to trade reciprocity with other nations. So the debate started really early. It was a common practice. I mean, it was not like this was something new.
That's interesting. I'm interested in this. There was some measure of reasoning behind the Southern secession regarding tariffs, too. The Southern states, I know, felt the pressure from the protectionist tariffs in the North. So tell me, how did those tariffs evolve in the decades leading up to the Civil War?
Well, for much of that period, from 1789 up to the Civil War, tariffs remained primarily a tool for revenue generation. This was easily handled because you have to remember that the government's yearly operating budget amounted to something like 3.5% of the gross national income from the beginning of our republic until 1933.
Just like it is today, 3.5%.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Tariffs accounted for about 90% of the federal government's total income during that time. However, there were heated disagreements, as you've already noted, especially between the industrializing North, which often favored higher tariffs for protection, and the agricultural South, which relied heavily on exporting crops and worried about increased costs for imported goods. All right. And this was not only from the North. It was from England. For example, you take cotton. They were exporting cotton to England. England would then run it through its mills and produce linen. That linen would be resold in the United States with, export tariffs put on it as well. When the North starts to play with it, the South suffers. See? So
speaking about suffering, let's talk about the infamous Tariff of Abominations in 1828. That fits into this picture too, right?
Exactly. The Tariff of 1828 was a prime example of tariffs used for protectionism. It significantly increased the cost of imported goods, which benefited northern industries but angered the South, exacerbating those regional tensions. In the late 1820s, South Carolina Senator Robert Haynes' debates with Daniel Webster on the subject perfectly capture the Southern sentiment of wanting to be left alone economically. They were already talking about nullification of federal laws and secession then.
Back in the 1820s. I didn't know that.
Exactly, yeah.
And then came the Civil War. How did the tariffs play a role then?
Well, the Morrill Tariff of 1861 was enacted as the war was brewing. Okay, the war hadn't started yet, but this tariff was passed. Its goals were to protect American manufacturers, but it also wound up eventually generating revenue for the Union war effort. There's no mystery that the Southern states saw this as another, economic blow, further contributing to their decision to secede.
Well, why weren't the Southern states benefiting from that tariff too? Because England was retaliating when they were sending over stuff like cotton and things like that?
Exactly. England would retaliate. And here's the thing. if you think clearly about where the source of cotton was, we basically had it in the South. But when the high tariffs were placed on these things, England looked for another source of their cotton. And where did they get it? Egypt. So Egyptian cotton was competing now with Southern States cotton, So and the Egyptian cotton was much less.
Yeah.
So they were damaging the production of cotton. Not so much tobacco, but they did the same thing with tobacco. England was expanding its empire, and they were using the resources of their colonies. And that was to the detriment of the South.
Right.
So from the period between 1861 and 1933, this period is generally characterized by a focus on restriction, right? Using high tariffs to shield domestic industries from foreign competition. But there was a retaliation. With the South gone after the Civil War, lawmakers in the North significantly boosted the average tariff rate from an historical 20% to around 50%. All right, you take the Dingley Act of 1897 as a key example of this era, raising tariff rates to protect American businesses.
But this was a period of extraordinary growth for America. It sounds like high tariffs were the norm for a long time. What changed that?
Well, several factors contributed to the shift. The Underwood Tariff of 1913 marked a break from this trend. Now, remember what's happening in 1913.
I think I remember.
Right? We are already industrialized. But if we were going to get rid of the tariffs to make our products more sellable, all right, reducing competition from external tariffs, what had to happen? This could only be done with the ratification of the 16th Amendment in 1913 to establish a federal income tax. This meant the government didn't need to rely as heavily on tariffs for revenue. Now the government had their hands in the pockets of the American people. So, in other words, taxation took the place of tariffs. So they could reduce the tariffs so they could sell their products, more easily overseas because they were already in a position to compete.
Well, even with the income tax, we still had some pretty significant tariffs, like the Smoot-Hawley tariff during the Great Depression.
Oh, absolutely. The Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930 is claimed to be a major misstep. All right. This led to a significant increase in tariffs. Okay. Really went up somewhere over 50%. Conventional wisdom states that instead of helping the economy, it worsened the Great Depression by triggering retaliatory tariffs from over 30 nations, causing a massive decline in international trade. It's often cited as a cautionary tale against protectionism.
Well, wasn't there a lesson to be learned there?
Yes, but what lesson? Smoot-Hawley is what economists all point to in attacking Trump's tariff strategies. I question blaming Smoot-Hawley alone for the disastrous results. We have to remember that during the Great Depression, the entire world was depressed. Everyone's economies were affected. Everyone was using tariffs to try to stabilize their economies. Now, Rob, let's consider something for a moment. Smoot-Hawley was declared a protectionist measure to favor buying American-made products within America over imported products, and that it would increase industrial productivity and jobs. Okay? This is what their reasoning was. How can you do this if the Federal Reserve contracted the money supply by 30%? Where was the money for all this going to come from internally? It was impossible to increase industrial productivity and provide jobs with the Fed working internally against us. And yet no one mentions the Fed as playing a key factor in the failures of Smoot-Hawley obtaining its objectives.
Well, I have no love of the Fed, but I never thought about that.
Yeah. Yeah. And what about food prices? Food prices generally crashed due to a combination of factors, including oversupply of food from the 1920s and a bumper harvest in 1929. And there was a significant decrease in the aggregate demand caused by widespread unemployment and bank failures. With increased unemployment reaching 20% and decreased wages, many Americans could not afford food, further driving prices down. In other words, the farmers suffered because they were too efficient in producing food. Okay? There was too much of a supply and not enough demand. So the prices went down and they began to complain. The lack of large-scale programs to distribute excess food resulted in spoilage even while people went hungry. Now, I said went hungry. There is a myth going around. I have no idea where this myth originated, but there was a myth that millions of people died of hunger, of starvation during this period, But it's not actually true. There are no indications that millions of people died. There was a lot of malnutrition, and people died from the effects of malnutrition, but not from hunger, okay? And so going back to the prices, for instance, Chicago wheat prices plummeted by approximately 66% between July of 1929 and 1931. In 1933, the Dust Bowl led to a decline in agricultural production, causing food prices in the agricultural sector to rise again. In the same year, President Roosevelt allotted $75 million to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration to purchase food from farmers, providing them with a revenue to continue farming. And this had nothing to do with Smoot-Hawley. Tariffs on foreign grain played no role. Also, no one seems to remember that the U.S. was lending huge sums of money to Germany to pay their war reparations to France and England under the Treaty of Versailles, who in turn used those monies to pay back Americans for the war loans to them. So listen to the scheme. We give money to Germany, loans that they have to pay back with interest. They in turn pay their war reparations to France and England, who in turn gives us back the money. So you see the scheme there. So we had this thing going around. Tariffs, I think, didn't have much to play with that. There were a lot of things affecting the world economy. I think the foreign governments would have increased their tariffs on American goods regardless of Smoot-Hawley. You can't point just to Smoot-Hawley and say, it was disastrous.
Wasn't the Federal Reserve created to stop these boom and bust cycles? Yet very soon after it's created, we've got a boom and bust cycle.
Yeah, well, they were created specifically for one purpose, to expand the money supply in times of crisis.
And to fund war.
Oh, yeah, well, the thing is that the 16th Amendment had two purposes. One of them eliminated tariffs, reduced them, the use of tariffs, or let's say the percentage of tariffs. The other was to provide a guarantee to the Federal Reserve for loans that the government would get from the Federal Reserve. So at the same time, I would imagine there were not enough monies coming in from tariffs to support the government's activities and pay loans to the Federal Reserve. So it was a necessary step. The 16th Amendment was a necessary step to satisfy the Fed, keep that machine running, to pay back interest on loans that they were giving to the government. And at the same time, to encourage the economy internally. But at the very same time, government began to put its hands in the Americans' pockets. It was, as Dr. Tom DiLorenzo said, it was the first assault on property rights of Americans by the federal government.
All right. Well, it sounds like such a goofy scheme to me.
Yeah. Another major difference between Smoot-Hawley and Trump is that, economically speaking, we are the ones retaliating. Our trade partners have provoked us. In other words, they're worried about retaliation, citing Smoot-Hawley, but they don't seem to understand we are the ones who are offended. We're the ones retaliating. But that's only if you look at it in terms of retaliation. I don't think Trump is looking at it in those terms, but we can get to that maybe a little later.
All right. I don't think I've heard that from the media.
No.
But after that, did the U.S. generally move toward lower tariffs at that time period?
Yeah, after Smoot-Hawley, yeah. The period from 1933 onwards saw a greater focus on reciprocity, okay, with policymakers starting to lower trade barriers. Okay, the Reciprocal Tariff Act of 1934, all right, it was a year after Smoot-Hawley, was a key piece of legislation allowing the president, now hear it closely, because this is the key,
I'm listening.
allowing the president to negotiate bilateral trade agreements to mutually reduce tariffs. Okay? Keep that in mind, because that is what Trump is doing. This laid the groundwork for future agreements like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT. You remember GATT 1 and GATT 2 and all that, which aimed to cover international trade in goods and was later superseded by the World Trade Organization.
All right. So for a long time, the trend was towards lower tariffs and freer trade. But I guess now in recent years, particularly with the Trump administration, we saw a different approach. Now, what do you think is the goal behind these tariffs?
Well, this is where it gets interesting and perhaps diverges from some of the historical protectionist motivations we've already talked about, right? I recently heard Mark Levin's take on his show, on Fox News, and I couldn't have said it better. I mean, I think he nailed it right on the head. President Trump's tariffs are not intended to be protectionist in the traditional sense.
So it's not protectionist. That's the key point. What did Levin say was the aim?
Well, Levin argues that Trump's primary goal is to break down trade and tariff barriers in other countries. Now, remember, he isn't trying to shield American industries, but rather to create a more global free market economic system where the U.S. could also sell and trade freely. We're the ones who've been offended for the last 40 years, like I said, right? Levin emphasizes that Trump wants reciprocal trades to pressure other nations to lower their own barriers. This is the objective.
So now Europe, as we speak here in April of 2025, is balking at this idea.
Oh, they're squealing like stuck pigs.
And I'm guessing it's because they've been protecting their own industries for 40 years or so.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. With the complicity of most of the American administrations for the last 40 years.
So without this protection, they're going to be under economic strain. And how are they going to pay for their socialist programs?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They sit there and they talk about, all these social programs that they have over here. Those social programs are running on our backs. We've been paying for it, not them. The things that we are paying for, they're using those to offset things that they don't have to pay for, that they could spend in their social, protection umbrellas and all this other crap. They know that if the United States enforces these tariffs, they're going to collapse. It's just not sustainable.
Some of my more liberal friends are claiming that we're going to irreparably harm our relationship with our allies. What do you say to that?
Well, let me ask you something, Rob. If you had a friend who was a thief, who came into your home and constantly went from your home with your silverware or some other thing of value every time he came to visit you, what would you do? These people have been stealing from us for 40 years, maybe even longer. All right? And you think, hey, listen, they want to get tit for tat. Let's say, okay, you want to keep your tariffs high? We will reciprocate. And if you don't like that, how about if we pull our 2 carrier fleets out of the Red Sea? How about if we do that? You see, we are protecting the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Now, 40% of global trade transits through that waterway. Okay? And 80% of the trade to Europe goes through that waterway. What if the Americans just say, all right, we're going to call our Navy back? Who do you think is going to protect that strait or the Red Sea? You think Germany's going to do it?
I think I'm getting your drift here. You're saying they'll come back eventually because they can't pay for their own defense.
They have no choice. They have no choice. What if we do the same thing in the Indian Ocean? You know how much trade transits there? Do you know what it would do to the prices of food, coffee, energy, all sorts of input? if those new trade routes had to go around the Horn of Africa and into the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar rather than into the Eastern Mediterranean? I mean, these people don't think. They have no idea of what they're doing. They either have to come to the table or they're going to suffer even worse consequences. And in the end, it's going to benefit them. It will benefit them because if you have parity in trade, you're going to push that more towards zero as a tariff. And that's free trade. Now, I have to ask you, for the United States and Great Britain, when was the wealthiest part of our history?
Well, it was in the 19th century and in the Roaring 20s.
Exactly. The latter part of the 19th and early 20th. We had tariffs, okay? But there was generally free trade, or at least reciprocal trade. So either you have fair trade, which I would, reciprocal is fair trade, or free trade. If you can't have free trade, then hey, what you're charging me, I'm going to charge you. It's really that simple.
All right. Let's get back to the purpose of this.
Okay.
We're a little bit off on a tangent, but I think we can come right back.
All right. Well, you asked me about Mark Levin. That's his interpretation, and I completely agree with it. He suggests that Trump is saying you're placing heavy tariffs on our goods and subsidizing your businesses while trying to harm ours. Now, what does subsidy do to our businesses producing the same products? If their governments are subsidizing their products, they can sell it for less in the United States, less than our own producers. This happens all the time. I heard Victor Davis Hanson talking about this, about raisins, how they went from $1,200 a ton to $400 a ton in less than 3 months because the Europeans were subsidizing the growth of grapes and the production of raisins, and they were putting substandard raisins in the market, and we couldn't compete. The raisin industry in California collapsed. All right? This is another tactic they use. So the tariffs are a way to fight that.
I thought my raisin brand tasted a little chalky.
Chalky. And I want to tell you something. You want to know what the best raisins sold in Italy are? The most prized California raisins. It's a selling point.
Sun-kissed.
Well, I have seen Sun-kissed here, but no, it'll be under an Italian brand, but they put on the thing, boom, California raisins. Yeah.
Nice.
That's not free trade. Let's put it that way. And it needs to stop. According to Levin, to get back to Mark Levin, Trump believes that by imposing tariffs, he could then negotiate arrangements where other countries would reduce their tariffs and trade barriers. The 90-day hold on tariffs, with the exception of China, is an opportunity for other nations to come to the table and negotiate fairer trade deals. I think the other countries have got the message because about 130 of them are now making efforts to come to the table as we speak today.
Well, Dr. Tom, we all know tariffs are just one part of their manipulation. I mean, they manipulate their currencies. They have the VAT tax. They have their protectionist strategies beyond tariffs.
You're talking about China.
Well, I'm also talking about Europe with the VAT tax and some.
Well, the VAT tax, yes, but they're not manipulating their currency like China. But, what does it tell you? His plan is working. His plan is working. So if you want to talk about the specific case of China.
Yes, I do.
Okay. Well, as far as communist China goes, that's a distinct problem. In my personal view, you're never going to get free or fair trade from them as partners. It's not within their dogma. First of all, they don't believe in property rights. They don't believe you have ownership of anything. But Levin suggests that Trump has a case-specific objective in mind regarding China's trade practices, particularly stopping them from stealing from us, ripping us off, and flooding our markets. In other words, it's China's unfair practices that are the key motivation, not necessarily the trade imbalance.
So Levin's analysis paints a picture of Trump's tariffs as a tool for achieving global free trade and pushing back against unfair practices rather than a simple return to historical protectionism. Am I right? Did I get that right?
Yeah, that seems to be the crux of Levin's argument, and I think he's on the money. Well, he is a Philly guy. So, yeah. So what can I tell you? He's a Pennsylvania man. So, I think he's right. I think he's right. The U.S. has been victimized for far too long, and it's time we stood up and said enough. Trump's tariffs are not punitive nor protectionist, but a reasonable stab at promoting international free market capitalism for everyone's benefit. Everyone will benefit, okay? After all, the CCP's unfair trade practices aren't just directed at us. They're against everyone else as well. All right.
Well, Dr. Tom, I think we have the upper hand here because what is it? They import 1/5 of what we import from them.
Yes.
So if they put tariffs on our products, so what?
That's exactly right.
We're not selling to them anyway.
No, we can't sell there anyway.
Where are they going to sell their goods if it's not to us?
Exactly. And what do you think is going to happen? Their economy's already beginning to crumble. It's already beginning to fracture. So you're absolutely right. We have high tariffs on our stuff going in. We can't sell there anyway. When was the last time you saw a Ford driving around China? You'll never see it.
I was in China in 2018. I saw not one American
car. I could guarantee it. So what do we care if they put a 500% tariff on American cars? We're not selling them there anyway.
I did see Velveeta cheese somewhere.
Oh, really? How do you know it was? How do you know it wasn't? How do you know it wasn't counterfeit?
Oh, could have been.
It's another thing that people don't seem to understand, and the Europeans, in their, as we say in Italian, frenesia, to try to counterbalance what's going on with America, they're extending the offers to China. They don't seem to realize that China will do to them exactly what they did to the United States.
All right, so let's get back to Levin. He's illustrating what?
Well,
what is he saying?
What Levin is really saying illustrates the contrast between Trump's approach with the protectionist mindset of the 1930s and argues that Trump, unlike Franklin Roosevelt, is deregulating the economy internally and seeking economic growth, not increasing regulations and stifling growth, which was the aim of FDR's policy. Levin even goes so far as to suggest that Trump might turn out to be the greatest free trader to ever sit in the Oval Office if his strategy works to break down the trade barriers globally. I find it interesting that all the naysayers and supposed economic experts are not considering the world as we live in today. Now, I'm a great admirer of economists like Adam Smith and Milton Friedman. And I know what their thoughts were on tariffs. They were against them. I trust their views implicitly. But I have to balance my admiration with a question. Would they hold the same opinions in today's environment? For example, in the case of China, they are only sustainable as long as they continue stealing trade secrets, violating contracts, taking over foreign companies, and ignoring patents, intellectual property rights, and brand trademarks. They don't seem to be capable of innovation and must take innovation from others. I have to wonder what they would have thought. I'm obviously talking about Smith and Milton Friedman, what they would have thought about global trade with a dishonest, thieving counterpart. I do have my concerns, however. I'm hoping that Mr. Trump's tariff policy is short-term and truly aims towards reciprocal or zero balance trade tariffs. Once this is achieved, we should be able to maintain and favor further foreign commercial investment by having competitively low corporate taxes and minimal regulations.
Dr. Tom, I've been thinking about China, and I'm wondering why they can't compete on the same level with us. Hell, they're paying their workers $3 a day or whatever. And it occurred to me that perhaps this is a lesson for the rest of the world, that authoritarianism works in the short term, but in the long term fails and becomes non-competitive, and that you can't beat your people and still compete in today's world.
Well, yeah, that's if you're looking at China, let's say in the capitalist system, they're not playing those games. China is playing a different game. China is using the monies that it's taking in trade, and they're applying it towards influence in other areas of the world. They did it on the Panama Canal. They're doing it in Africa with their, Belt and Road system. What they do is they lend money and build the infrastructures in these countries, and when the countries can't pay it back, they go in and take over the assets.
Yeah, we've seen that time and again. Yeah.
There is a global conquest behind their trade. They don't give a damn about fair markets and that. They have another objective in mind, and it's not a pretty objective.
Well, this is likely to shorten up their footprint a little bit.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
If it works.
Absolutely. And, when you talk about productivity, the American worker is 4 times as productive as the Chinese worker. In other words, it takes 4 Chinese to match the productivity of 1 American. So what are we afraid of? And I'm telling you right now, I've been following what's happening in China, and there are companies that are closing. They're shutting down. They have no one to sell to.
Okay. I've got one more question now that I'm thinking about this. This is all happening so quickly. China hasn't had time to react, to adjust. If they're going to collapse, they might become vengeful or stir up things that perhaps we weren't thinking about, perhaps even violent reactions. Are you considering that we could be on the brink of something much more violent with this?
You can never tell, but I don't think that they're that foolish. I don't think they're that foolish. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to put a gun to somebody's head and say, buy my products?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. They're funding, to a large degree, Russia's advance. They're funding Iran. So all that money's going to dry up.
Yeah, well, let me tell you something about Russia. Once we get this deal done with the Ukraine, you're going to see American businesses going into Russia in partnership with the Russians. You're going to see when this thing normalizes, all of these sanctions against Russia are going to come down. They have to. Russia has to be permitted to compete on the international stage. They have to be reintroduced to the G8. They've got to be. They're a major player in world affairs. They need to be at the table.
Yeah, but Dr. Tom, can I play the devil's advocate here?
Sure.
We said that 20 years ago about China. We have to bring them into the world economy. And look what happened. They turned into our greatest enemy.
Yeah, but Russia won't do that. Russia does not have the same objectives that the CCP does, number one. And number two, Russia can become a very, very wealthy place. It's sitting on resources that you can't even imagine. I mean, it's practically $100 trillion of rare earths and energy that they're sitting on that they can't tap. They need American and Western technology to do that.
All right.
They would benefit. Look, the way to end war is common commercial interests where everyone benefits.
Except, Dr. Tom, in the case of China, we said that.
Yeah.
And look what happened.
I think that they were misled, and it was to our detriment. Basically, what they were trying to do was stabilize Southeast Asia. You got to remember when we started doing this. When was it? Who went over to visit China first?
It was Nixon.
Right. And that was right after Vietnam. And these people still have that mindset that, a domino effect, all this, they still were in that mindset. And on top of it, at the time, what we were trying to do was keep Russia and China separated. We were trying to keep them separate.
How'd that work out?
It worked out fine for a while because the Russians really didn't care much for the Chinese, and the Chinese didn't care much for the Russians. So there was no reason for them to unite. But I think that the Chinese, I want to be optimistic. I think that they're fooling themselves. Now, I'm not talking about the Chinese people. I'm talking about, the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, we've already said they can't sell to Europe. There's not enough of a market there. They can't sell to us. They're not going to sell to Russia. They're propping Russia up. So they're in a little bit of a pickle here.
Yeah, right now, Russia, their trade is with, I don't even think that they require that much energy from Russia. And they're not going to get a hell of a lot out of North Korea.
They can't sell to themselves. They don't have the population growth.
No. What is it, 1.1%?
Yeah.
With that failed one-child policy?
Yeah, I think it sucks to be them right now, but I hope that it doesn't blow up into something a little bit more violent.
I'm not sure the Chinese people would stand for it. I'm not sure they would stand for it. The genie's been let out of the bottle. These small economies that started in the south of China had to be recognized by the Communist Party. So they created state capitalism, Well, state capitalism is nothing more than fascism. That's what it is. That was the definition of fascism.
Right.
The interest of corporate structures with the interests of the government. Okay. The amalgamation. Right.
You make it and we'll tell you we'll tell you what to do with it.
Exactly. And if you get too big, we'll take it from you and you disappear. What happened to that guy Ma? Right.
Right.
And that's what they do with foreign companies too.
Yeah.
The foreign companies will go in there, they'll work out some kind of a deal. Hey, you guys produce this at these rates. Blah, blah. Yeah, that's a good idea. Once the market grows for those companies, they take them over, kick the people out and nationalize the company. It's the same thing the Russians did with fiat.
Well, I'll tell you what, if this works and some of our manufacturing can come back, and when I drive through the Rust Belt, I don't have to look at these shanty towns with nobody there and trash in the streets. And, if I don't have to look at rusting steel mills in Bethlehem and Coatesville and so forth, I'll be really happy. And I think the American people will be too.
Well, you see, here's the thing now. The first incentive of these tariffs, no matter how you look at it, the United States government is going to gain monetarily from this, no matter how you look at it. But it does another thing. If these people want to play with tariffs and they want to argue and raise their tariff, all this kind of thing, it benefits companies to come in here and produce, come into the United States and produce. And we've already seen something like, I think $7 or $8 trillion of investment coming in. The reason for it is, number one, they won't have to pay the tariffs if they produce their products in the United States with American workers. All right. Number two, they will be getting a corporate tax reduction compared to where they're coming from. And number three, they will have less onerous rules and regulations around their businesses. So that'll be the incentive for them to come in a short term. It benefits them. So it benefits the United States and it benefits the American worker.
Well, I hope so, because if not, then I will regret that I didn't vote for Kamala Harris. She could have engineered something even better, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Maybe something that, what was the term she used? Something that was unburdened by what has been.
Yeah, we wouldn't be unburdened by what has been.
Think of something new, something unburdened by what has been. She couldn't think her way out of a paper bag.
Well, listen, we're running out of time. We can get to her some other day. She's not worth the time, I don't think.
Yeah. No, she wasn't worth a vote, and she's not worth the time.
This has been a really, really interesting perspective, Dr. Tom, and it helps to contextualize, I think, the recent tariff debates within a much longer history. But like I said, we're out of time. And I just want to thank you so much for shedding light on the historical use of these tariffs in the U.S. and for injecting Mark Levin's analysis of Trump's administration's goals.
Yeah, I think he nailed it. He was right on the money. Right on the money.
Well, this has been insightful. So thank you.
Oh, it was my pleasure, Rob. Thanks for having me again.
Always a pleasure. Well, that was Dr. Tom Giordano giving us an interesting historical perspective on the tariff debate. And you can join us next time on the Liberty Brief for more insightful discussions. You've been listening to the Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.